Good morning, Rotarians. How are you? It's really good to be back amongst my Westview Rotary family. I'm honored to be invited, so thank you, Cecile and Frank, for reaching out and asking for this presentation. So hopefully we won't have too many technical glitches and I'll be able to pull this off. So as Cecile mentioned, my family and I opened Houston Hemporium last year. And it was really important for us to go beyond just what you see at the CBD store level because hemp has been an important part of my family, as you heard in the intro, for a very long time. And I've actually been interested in hemp since the 90s when we saw the availability of hemp fiber and hemp clothing coming here into the US when Canada legalized the growth of industrial hemp. So let's get this show on the road. All right, so what is hemp? Because a lot of people don't realize that there's a difference between hemp and what we kind of know as pot or marijuana. So cannabis sativa L, that L is actually an important distinction. Cannabis sativa L is actually the cousin of what we kind of have heard to be cannabis or marijuana. And what's interesting is that in a lot of legal documents, you will find marijuana is actually spelled with an H, not with a J. And that is simply because that was the original Spanish spelling of the term, and that's what it was used when it was codified in documents. So federal and state laws have a definition. The hemp plant can contain no greater than 0.3% volume of delta-9 THC, which is what everybody knows for the psychoactive properties that pot or marijuana is known for. So that's the delineator, this legal definition of 0.3%, and that's very important in a lot of legal documents. All right, so what can you make with hemp? The shirt that I'm wearing is made from hemp. Hemp has what a lot of people say thousands of uses. I like to say hundreds simply because you can get really picky with the different uses. But as someone who does not eat meat, I love hemp seed protein. For me, it's a really wonderful source of protein. So I actually use hemp seed pretty much daily in my diet, and I love how clean the protein is. But fabric, paper, oil, animal bedding, composite materials, one of my favorite things that I love about hemp is its flexibility because you can use literally every part of the plant. And in our store, we actually have a couple of samples. One is called hempcrete, which is a concrete type substance made from hemp herds mixed with a lime binder. It's actually a lighter weight material than traditional concrete, and it has greater tensile strength and structural stability, so I love that. And for those of you who know me, you know that my original job is in design and planning of commercial real estate properties. And so when I see things like composites and biomaterials from hemp, that is really exciting to me to kind of push my industry forward as well. The fibers, the textiles, they can also be used in commercial applications because hemp has, similar to wool, hemp has a flammability resistance to it. It also has UV resistance, which is why it was used for sails and ropes in ships for so long, is because it didn't degrade like cotton did. It stood this test of time, and it also got softer with age. So it's one of the beautiful things about hemp. And on the composite board, it's a really wonderful option to like a plywood or an oriented strand board as a substrate for other materials. And it doesn't require binders that tend to off-gas toxic materials. So it's an amazing plant. So that's what we have for some of the things that you can make from it. But down in the corner, the CBD seems to be the big question that everybody's asking about. What is up with this CBD business, and why are these businesses popping up everywhere? So as we get into this, I mentioned briefly the legal status. So in 1937, hemp was unfortunately grouped together with marijuana in the Marijuana Stamp Act, and so we could no longer grow hemp here in the U.S. until a little brief window of opportunity called the Hemp for Victory program during World War II, where we could not import hemp from the Philippines, where we were getting a lot of our hemp fiber for our ropes and our sails. And so we had a short opportunity where farmers were actually provided seed by the government to grow hemp. But once World War II was over, that went away. So then in 2014, there was a federal pilot program that several states signed up for, where they started growing hemp again. I think one of the most successful states is Kentucky. They have done some amazing things with converting old tobacco farms into hemp farms. And then in 2018, the Farm Bill, the US Farm Bill, formally descheduled or decriminalized hemp, which means that we can now grow hemp in all 50 states. Now, the interesting thing is a lot of states will peg their legislation to federal legislation. And so what happened is, just because it was federally decriminalized, each state that may have had additional legislation barring the growth of that then had to go through their own legislative process to also deschedule that, which is why it took until 2019, because Texas runs every 2 years for their legislature and on the odd years. So Texas House Bill 1325 was one of a lot of bills that were floating around in 2019, but this is the one that actually went through, that legalized the cultivation and processing of hemp here in Texas. A lot of people don't realize Texas was the largest producer of hemp before it was scheduled and made illegal to grow. Texas obviously is a huge state, and we have extraordinary history in agriculture. So this is what is really exciting to me, is an opportunity for our farmers who are really struggling, whether it's because cotton is super water intensive or labor intensive or chemical intensive, or they're looking for ways to still stay in agriculture and not sell off their multi-generational family lands to developers. Now, I'm in commercial real estate, so development is important to me, but at the same time, balancing development with agriculture is extremely important. And so I would love to see more of our Texas family farms be able to stay in agriculture and transition over to growing hemp. So at the federal level, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is currently drafting rules on exactly the process that farmers have to follow, and labs who test the product. Because at the end of the day, USDA and Texas Department of Agriculture, it's not just about growing it, it's about testing it to make sure that it stays under that 0.3% that we talked about earlier, to ensure that it is truly hemp and not seen as marijuana. Really briefly, in Texas, we have something called the Texas Compassionate Use Act, or TCUP for short. That is Texas' version of medical marijuana. And that is for people who have certain neurodegenerative disorders, intractable epilepsy, a number of different very specific illnesses. It's kind of like hemp, it's 0.5% THC. So there's a very narrow difference between what Texas sees as medical cannabis and hemp. But it is helpful, and we need to make sure that people have the opportunity to have access to that for those who have disorders and degenerative diseases that have been shown to be helped by medical cannabis. All right, so what is CBD? So it's funny because it's sometimes hard to pronounce, right? Cannabidiol doesn't roll off the tongue really beautifully. CBD is one of the most popular components in cannabis, besides THC for some, and they're called cannabinoids. So they're all grouped together under this umbrella called cannabinoids, both CBD and THC. Cannabis contains over 100 cannabinoids. I think the last count I saw was 114 have been identified. But CBD and THC are by far the greatest and most known components. And so they're called the major cannabinoids. The other cannabinoids are generally referred to as minor cannabinoids if you see it in writing. So like with all plants, and anybody who may be in agriculture or work with a lot of botanicals, cannabis can be engineered to have different ratios of cannabinoids, which is why when you get into that 0.3% of THC, people can really fine tune that. So they can engineer that in the lab at the seed level, at the clone level, which is where it tends to be easier to work with farmers and create clones, or have a mother plant and then they cut little pieces off and they plant those. So it can be engineered to be higher in cannabinoids and have very low to no THC in it. So very exciting. You're seeing a lot of agriculture schools or courses within universities that are really studying the engineering of cannabis and making cannabinoids much more available and bringing down the THC. All right, so a lot of people are like, why does it work? So you see over on the right-hand side, this is a poster that we actually have up at the store, and we encourage people, if they come in, to take a picture of it, to look at it and really understand what is happening. So all vertebrates, and by the way, this endocannabinoid system that we're talking about, if you're wondering why your doctor didn't learn about this in med school, it's because the endocannabinoid system was really initially identified in about 1988. And it was all through the 90s that people started really studying what was up with this endocannabinoid system. And so a lot of folks went to med school before that, and medical school doesn't exactly change their curriculum just because there's some interesting new developments. It takes a lot of proof of concept in order for there to be a change at the curriculum level. And so that's why it's really only just now that a lot of folks who are going through medical school are starting to hear about this. I spoke with a physician last week at a symposium. She graduated in 2012, and she hadn't heard about the endocannabinoid system in med school. So it's very interesting. So the endocannabinoid system, the reason it works not only for humans and for our furry friends, is because if you're a vertebrate, you have this system. And this system has what are called receptors. So these receptors respond to different inputs. And by the way, cannabis is not the only plant that has cannabinoids. There are other leafy greens, there are other vegetables that have cannabinoids. And so this is the beautiful thing. It just happens to be that when they found the system and they kind of discovered it in the testing that they were doing, it was named endocannabinoid, endo meaning internal to the body, but cannabinoid being it was most responsive to what was found in cannabis, and that's why they used that name. So these receptors, CB1 and CB2, respond to inputs. The CB1 receptor, which is in this format, the brown dots, is why THC does what it does, because there's a lot of CB1 receptors in the head. And so that's why people get that sort of high feeling. But they also run along the neural pathways. And so for folks who you've probably seen some of the news stories on why it works for people who have epilepsy and who have spasticity, it's because of the location of those receptors that it does the job. CB2 receptor is what's more responsive to CBD. So as my husband Tom likes to remind people, the H in THC is for the head, the B in CBD is for the body. And so those receptors reside in a lot of the major organs, and it's why a lot of people use CBD for a variety of different things. All right, so how does it work? So the best way that I can try to describe this is that it's kind of like a series of locks and keys. And so the central nervous system, the major organs, the immune system has the endocannabinoid system internal to it. And these cannabinoids, when they are brought into the body, and they can be inhaled, they can be ingested, they can be topically applied, they act as these keys that kind of go into the locks that are part of this system. So this system is a regulator. And so when you use cannabinoids, it helps your own system to modulate responses to certain things like pain or inflammation. So it's a really interesting sort of set. And we can talk about this a little bit later if we have time, but how you take it, inhalation versus ingestion versus topically, will also determine how much of it you actually get into your bloodstream. So a lot of people ask, well, I've seen full spectrum CBD and I've seen this isolate and I don't really understand the difference. And so because, like we talked about before, hemp has over 100 cannabinoids, including THC, when you say, I need to remove this THC, I want CBD that has no THC attached to it whatsoever, you can do that in the lab. You can either isolate it or distill it, but it's generally referred to as a 0 THC isolate, meaning that when it goes through its lab testing, it will show no detectable THC whatsoever. Full spectrum CBD simply means that you're already starting with a hemp plant that is testing below that 0.3%. So the plant itself is meeting all the federal and state requirements to be defined as hemp, but it may have small detectable amounts of THC. So why does this matter? I know a lot of my friends and our clients who are veterans, they're first responders, they work in the oil and gas field and the medical fields, and they drug test. Now, your metabolism is different than my metabolism. And so I may be able to take full spectrum CBD and never have any THC show up on a drug test because my metabolism works in a certain way. But some people may have a metabolism where the THC, even though it's in tiny little amounts and it is legal, builds up in the liver. And when you take that drug test, it may show a tiny, tiny amount. And for those of you who have employers or you're getting your benefits at the VA, that matters. It's critical. And so that is why it was so important to us to make sure that when we looked at what we were offering, we have a significantly greater volume of 0 THC products available than full spectrum, because it was super important to us that those who wanted to try this were not going to be testing what's called hot, basically. We don't want anybody losing a job or losing benefits because they're trying to seek relief from pain and inflammation. So that's why it's super important. So if you drug test, wherever you go, if you're going to try CBD, make sure you ask for 0 THC CBD. All right. So what is it used for? So I'm not going to tell you that it's good for all of these things, because quite frankly, that's making a medical claim, and I'm not a medical practitioner, and I'm not here to make medical claims. But what I can tell you is what I and my family use it for and have had great success with. So I have a lot of pain and inflammation in my neck from a dual accident. I had an industrial accident followed by an auto accident within 48 hours of each other when I was a teenager. And so that has meant that I've lived in chronic pain for about 30 years. It's not a fun journey. And I was really struggling with the side effects of the pharmaceuticals that the doctors were putting me on. It was tearing up my stomach, it was making me grouchy pants, and it was not a fun experience. And so I was seeking an alternative to that I felt was not going to have these negative side effects for me. My mom, and I have permission to tell her story, has multiple challenges. Fibromyalgia and rheumatoid arthritis being two of them, as well as osteoporosis. Last year, when I started sharing CBD with her to try, because her medication list is very long, I said, hey, let's try the CBD for the specific areas where you're really feeling a lot of pain. So I took her to her pain doc for a normal checkup. And you know when they ask you, like, what's your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? Most doctors will ask you that, especially when you're seeing specifically a pain doctor. I have never seen my mom really go below a 7. She has always lived in a high amount of pain. And she looked at him and she said, it's a 2. And I was like, oh, wait, did I hear that right? Did you say a 2? Because I've never heard you say a 2 before. It was one of those moments. And so we realized, you know what? This really is life-changing for us. But really what kind of was the ticker for me personally is I have a tear in my labrum in my left shoulder, and it had gotten to the point where my shoulder had completely frozen up, which meant that I could not actually have the surgery in order to repair it, because they won't do surgery when your shoulder's frozen. So you have to go through physical therapy to get to the point where your shoulder's unfrozen before they'll do the surgery. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna try CBD because the PT was so painful to do the exercises. I couldn't even dress myself. Like, Tom had to help me get dressed in the morning, take my clothes off at night. It was terrible. So I started using CBD in a topical application, and in less than a week, I had full range of motion back in my shoulder, and I thought, oh my goodness, this is huge. And so that's why we decided to go ahead and open up a hemp store that also has CBD. But what it is not a cure-all. It is not a panacea. For some people, every single person's chemistry is different. For some people, it does absolutely nothing. It happens. But for a lot of people, it has really helped with things like insomnia, because it helps relax. I'm not saying it quiets the mind, but it helps relax a lot of things in the body that build up in the tension that allow our minds to kind of spiral out. I'm a bit of an insomniac myself, and so I do take CBD at dinner time with a little bit, by the way, CBD, all cannabinoids bind to fat. So if you're really super skinny and you don't have very much body fat, you may not notice its effects without using it a little bit more consistently, because it binds to fat. So I take it maybe with a little dessert, has a little dairy solid, or if I'm having salmon at dinner, it loves omegas. And so it will bind to that. And so that really helps me not only fall asleep, but stay asleep all night long. And that was a huge change for me, because I used to wake up in the middle of the night a lot. And so by being able to get a full night's sleep, I'm way more rested and then less grouchy pants in the morning, because Tom can tell you that's not fun at all. I want to give a word of caution. If you're thinking about trying CBD, you are on an anticoagulant or a blood pressure medication, you need to talk to your doctor first. CBD, now it takes very high doses to do this, but in high doses, CBD can be a blood thinner, and it can slightly modulate blood pressure. So if you're on medication for that, you could have an interaction. It is extremely important to have a very frank conversation with your doctor or your nurse practitioner before you embark on that journey. Let's see, I don't know that I have any other slides. So I always want to say thank you to my Rotary family especially, because you all have been amazing. When I've had some of my health crises over the past few years, you have really embraced me and my family, and I am extremely grateful for that. So I don't know where we are on time, and if I have time for questions, if anybody has questions. By the way, if anybody wanted some of this information, maybe you didn't take a picture of it. I do have some brochures that has information about cannabis, hemp, CBD, that may better answer some of the questions that you have, and gives you information so that you can also stop by the store and ask questions in person. Yes, Miss Cecile.
Okay, I'm still confused.
Yes, ma'am.
How do you define? You can go to Walgreens, you can go to Kroger, you can find this bottle for $29.95, and then you can go to another store and it's $125. What is that? Why this difference? What's going on?
That's a great question. So we have found that knowing where your product comes from is critical. So for instance, at our store, we carry organic, non-genetically modified products made here in the US. That means the hemp is grown in the US, it's organically grown, it's organically processed. So sometimes when you find a really low price product, what you're not sure of is, was it a cannabinoid that was actually crafted in a lab, so it's considered a synthetic, or is it a truly hemp-derived CBD, first of all. You also don't know if that hemp was grown overseas, where it may have had a lot of other chemical inputs into it in that process. What's also really important to look for is look on the back of the label to see one of two things, either a QR code that you can put your smartphone on that will take you directly to a third-party lab test that tells you what is in there so you know what you're getting. So for instance, if the bottle says that each serving of whatever it is has a certain number of, or a certain volume, milligrams of CBD, that lab test should agree with that statement on the front of the bottle. What I have found is, because we like to do research, right? So we'll go around to, say, gas stations or Bed Bath & Beyond or some of these places that you've mentioned, and we'll buy something. Sometimes they have a QR code on it. Sometimes they just have a website. So you go to the website and then you're trying to find like lab tests and information. Really, that QR code, and by the way, as hemp becomes grown and processed here in Texas, if you're doing that in Texas, you actually have to put the QR code on that label. So you use the QR code, you go and look at the lab test, and the lab test will tell you a number of things. That it's 0 THC, or if it's full spectrum, that it is below the 0.3%, first of all, but then the amount of cannabinoids. And then a good lab test will be maybe a couple pages long. Sometimes they're just one page, but sometimes they're a couple pages long, and they actually go in and tell you a lot of other things. The rules that I was talking about that the USDA and the Texas Department of Agriculture are working on right now are defining some of the requirements of those lab tests. So right now there's no hemp growing in Texas. If there is, it's not in the legal zone. You can't put it in the ground right now because we don't have the registration process complete with the Texas Department of Agriculture. So for us, the transparency, the quality of the information, knowing where it came from, like we know that all of the CBD products that we carry in our store were either grown in Colorado, Oregon, or California. And organic is extremely important to us. Just like I like organic food, I want to minimize the amount of chemicals that I'm putting in my body. Same for the products that we have. So boutique stores like ours are absolutely going to be more expensive than gas station brands or places that might be a big box store that don't necessarily have the amount of transparency and information available to them. Yes, sir.
I have a question. How is this I'm just under USDA, but how is it regulated? How, you say 0.3%, that's a very, very, very small amount.
Yes, sir, it is.
Can they go to the store and pull a package and run a test on it immediately? It seems like it's the wild, wild west on this deal.
It's a bit of a Wild West, and
I'm asking for a friend.
Yeah, right. Hey, I'm with you on that. It is Wild West, and so part of the rules that are being drafted right now is this interrelationship between the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Public Safety. And the Department of Public Safety will be the authority that does the pulling and the testing. And so within those rules, they talk about when the farmers will have to test their crops before harvest, certain number of weeks, has to go to a very specific type of lab. That lab has to have these particular types of certifications already in place. Then, after that is tested, it gets tested again when it's either made into an isolate or a distillate to be used as a product. So there's actually multiple tests along the way. Once you actually have a product in a store, we are still waiting for the rules from the Department of Public Safety on exactly how an officer, for instance, can requisition a product. So in other words, is it a warrantless taking where they're just kind of coming in and doing a sweep, or is it someone complaining, filing a complaint with a retail store who says, hey, I think that what they're selling is not legal, and I think you need to go in and pull some product and test it. And so we don't even have those rules in place yet. And so yeah, we're all in a gray area. And that kind of is a little bit how innovation works sometimes, is that there is some cart before the horse happening where people are willing to get out there and kind of like let their tails hang out a little bit and potentially get in trouble while people work out exactly what that relationship is. But yes, as a retailer, I will have to be registered with the state once they finalize those rules. I believe I have 90 days from when the rules are final to actually register our retail store, and that then lets the Department of Public Safety know that we're following the rules. But then that also means that we're aware that they can come in at any time, and what we're waiting for is how much they can requisition, and then if something that we have tests hot, what is the process for curing that or remediating that to ensure that we are following the rules? Because since I live in a land of codes for my regular day job, I like to follow those rules. I like to know what it is. So thank you. Oh.
What's the percentage of THC in like in an edible or something like? I mean, I realize it varies, but what? Just for comparison's sake, like, do you know?
If it is not a
So
mark.
I'm like say.
So you're in a recreational state. Okay. All right. Great question. Yeah, right. So we talked about hemp being 0.3% and the Compassionate Use Act being 0.5% THC. In states that have recreational cannabis available, if you were to go and buy an edible, you could actually tell them what percentage of THC that you don't want to go above, but they have engineered it to the point of being up to 20%, which is, if you're reading studies about people having psychoses from medical cannabis, that is why. What has happened is they have engineered the THC to be so high that they have engineered out the CBD. And so this is where full spectrum and whole plant is really important. CBD are the brakes on THC. So if you engineer CBD out of cannabis and you just have THC, you don't have any kind of control mechanism on that THC, and that's where a lot of the mental health issues and the psychoses are taking place. Many tests, and by the way, we have in our resources hundreds of studies that we have downloaded from the National Institute of Health's repository to really understand how cannabinoids play with the human body. And they have studied on pretty much every system. And they have found that CBD is a very effective limiter of THC. So the most effective medical cannabis that we're seeing is a modest amount of THC with an equivalent amount of CBD or higher, so that it really acts as the buffer to keep the psychoactive properties of THC in check, so that the CB1 receptor that is responding to that THC can do its job on the neural pathways and allow for the release of that, especially with the youth that have epilepsy. Extraordinary studies being done with multiple sclerosis and Parkinson's as well right now. Thank you, great question. Yes, sir.
Two comments, actually.
Yes, sir.
I became heavily involved in this and researched it about 9 months ago.
Yeah.
And best talk that I've heard to date, most
Oh,
forthright.
thank you. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. Thank you.
And the second one is I'm going to give you a free testimonial. Real problems with arthritis in thumbs and forefinger, and my hands are very valuable to me.
Yes, sir.
Started taking CBD oil, one in the morning, one in the evening. Hasn't cured it, but I don't use ibuprofen anymore, and it makes it feel an awful lot better, and I will continue to use it for a very long time. Okay, third thing, mine doesn't cost $9.95.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah.
I think that's something you really need to look at. There's some stuff out there that will really harm you,
Yes, sir.
and since it isn't fully regulated, you can get a hold of real synthetic junk. So watch the price and watch the source.
There's an old adage, you get what you pay for, and that doesn't mean that people should charge egregious pricing just to make you think that you're getting really good stuff, but you're exactly right. There is some crap out on the market, the synthetic products, and you have no chain of custody, you don't know where it came from, you don't know what else may be in it. That's a scary Wild West area for me. Yeah.
Awesome.
Oh, I see.
Okay.
Mr. Campbell.
How is it done?
On the product or on the person? Drug tests typically are either done in a urinalysis-based form or in a hair-based form. You can see it done as part of a full blood panel as well. I know that a lot of oil and gas companies will actually do a hair test and not just a urinalysis test, because the way cannabis is metabolized by the body, if you are very low body fat, your system flushes it pretty easily, and so if you don't use it for, say, 30 days, it may be gone. Yes, sir. For the length of the hair, yes.
All right, last question. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Fabulous Rotarian camp. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for the invite.
Absolutely.